Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. For our Chinese-speaking audience, 欢迎收听道可道. So today's episode, we're quite excited about. Richard and I are now beginning a kind of rapid-fire recording of our series over the summer, and then we'll gradually release or unroll these episodes over the course of the fall semester. We only had a short time to prepare, but we knew that we liked the topic, and the topic is Confucians on assessing character, more specifically the analects of Confucius himself on the assessment of character, discerning how exactly you can tell whether someone has good character or bad, whether they're reliably trustworthy, honest, kind, generous, that kind of thing, right? Or whether they're in fact the kind of person who will turn on a dime and stab you in the back. So anyway, it's a great topic, and it's a very important one for the Confucians, so it seems like an important one to cover if you're going to have deep acquaintance with Confucianism. However, I have to say I want to begin by asking Richard a question. This question actually doesn't come up in the course of regular conversations among professional philosophers nowadays. Despite the fact that professional philosophers, many of them study virtue and virtue ethics, we don't actually talk all that much about the difficulty of figuring out whether someone is of good character or not, you know? And so I'm kind of curious whether you, Richard, approach this issue with skepticism, pessimism, optimism. I mean, do you think it is possible to figure out, or to at least have some relatively good inkling of whether someone is truly honest or truly kind and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. I'm very much into virtue ethics and really interested in virtue and character and moral psychology. I must say, one of the reasons why I think this topic is so interesting is that it connects well with actual concrete human life. I think we've all experienced times when we've misjudged someone's character in perhaps both directions. And I was also thinking, as you were bringing up this topic, about some experience from the past where I've, maybe seriously misjudged someone. And there's an example that came to my mind, which I guess I'll probably never forget, which is in a previous episode, I mentioned that at the tail end of high school, I started volunteering at this youth shelter. Called Casa Youth Shelter.
I remember that. Yeah.
In Los Alamitos and in California. And it was a great experience. But anyways, one of the things that I did was to help out for this a really crucial annual charity event where they fundraise quite a bit of money to support their cause each year. And it was a huge auction that they would get a lot of donations for items and people would bid on it. Sometimes you got really cool stuff. I remember Michael Jordan's signed basketball. Someone donated that. And then, you would auction it off and you would raise money. It was over at, I think it was a really nice hotel. Anyways, it was a great event. The person who headed it, Lydia, maybe I shouldn't say the last name maybe, but she was extremely nice. I remember meeting her. I really enjoyed helping her. So I would help move these items and help out in different ways at the charity. And I would always see her there. Anyways, it was a great event. Yeah. So then I went to college after high school and didn't really see her for many years. I think about 8 years after I last saw her, I came across this little article. I think it was the LA Times. And it said something like, Lydia, but her last name, sentenced for embezzling money. And it turned out that even during those years when I was helping her, she was stealing, I think 100 or 200,000 each year from the auction. And she had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars over the decade and was just buying luxury goods. I mean, it's not like she was in desperate need of money. And she was driving around in a fancy car. I can't remember exactly how they all found out. But anyways, I just was kind of blown away because I just remember her as this very pleasant, very generous person in my mind. But she was stealing money from a youth shelter, that were harboring runaway teenagers and treating them sometimes for drug addiction and whatnot. And she was taking away so much money from them, which is really a awful thing to do. And so, I never would have known, I mean, she was very sociable, affable, and, fun to be around. So that's my example.
Yeah, I have to say, actually, I've had a similar experience. It's in some ways even worse, but it's a little too personal, so I don't know if I really want to reiterate it at all. But anyway, I know what you mean. I've had this experience where someone you really thought of as actually quite sincere and upright in the various ways that just about anyone tends to admire and care about, it still turns out to be harboring some sort of secret plan and hatching some secret schemes that are deeply troubling. And so I know what you mean. But this makes me want to ask, just in anticipation of today's discussion, how many opportunities did you really have to get to know her? So for me, I'm troubled by that case, but I wouldn't be so troubled if you told me, well, I worked with her a couple of hours every month or something. Whereas if it's someone that, was a good friend and you like stayed up late talking about life, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I didn't spend that much. We weren't going out, meeting up all the time. Yeah, no, it was within that context at the youth shelter. I spent many hours, but it's not like I observed her actions throughout the course of the entire day or in different circumstances. And so, I guess my knowledge was fairly circumscribed and limited.
Yeah, well, we're going to discuss the Confucian view, and I think implicit in the Analects is a pretty strong argument for at least thinking that, while we can't perfectly detect someone's true character by any means, we can't even come close. Still, we have more and less reliable ways, or better and worse ways, of figuring out whether someone is of good character or not. And I think I'll just say this much. Looking back at my life, I can think of many cases where I misjudged someone's character, where my sort of initial impressions were all wrong. And the fact that I was able to realize later how wrong I was suggests to me that, in fact, it is possible to make a relatively good assessment of someone's character. Because in the end, with enough time and experience and direct contact, you come around to realizing your earlier mistake. And for what it's worth, I think the Confucians that we're going to discuss today wouldn't be surprised by that experience. So as I read these passages, at least a kind of tradition of interpreting these passages, the upshot is essentially that you have to share life with someone in order to really know them. There is a kind of optimism in classical Confucianism and early Confucianism that you can come to know a person's true character, but they understand that it's very difficult work, that it's not perfectly reliable, and so on. And the optimism is stipulated on, or depends upon, this assumption that you actually have opportunities to see someone sort of over the full course of their day, which really you only do when you're living and working and really kind of living among people, like seeing them in all phases of their day, all frames of mind.
Yeah, how do they act when they're stressed or when they're deprived of sleep, or how do they treat people who are of lower social standing in the workplace or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Because after all, character assessments are holistic assessments. They're not meant to give us a snapshot of how a person behaves at one particular moment. I mean, of course, we're interested in how people behave when they're under dire circumstances and a certain amount of heroism is demanded of them. That's important, but also a great deal of the day-to-day interactions, whether they're condescending when they talk to their work subordinates and that kind of thing. Those things matter too, and those things can only be detected by looking at the whole person and seeing how they behave under a wide variety of situations. So I suppose I should say that's what we're going to discuss after the intermission music. We'll be back shortly.
Okay, welcome back to part 2. Today's passages are on Confucian character assessment. We're going to look at 2 passages from the Analects, which are Analects 2:9 and 2:10. One of these describes how Confucius assesses the character of one of his students, Yen Hui. The other is a general outline of the steps you need to take or what you need to observe in order to assess character. We're going to start with first of those 2, Analects 2:9, where Confucius reports on how he came to recognize the virtue in his student Yen Hui.
Yeah, that's a good description of the 2 passages. So the first one, 2:9, Analects 2:9, is about Yen Hui, Confucius's student assessing Yen Hui himself, how Confucius does that. And the other one, Analects 2:10, seems to be abstracted from the assessment of any one person's character. It's more like an outline of how you assess character in general. Yeah, so we'll start with that first one, 2:9, on Yen Hui. Some of you know this so well, and others perhaps would be reminded of it. Yen Hui is probably the most important student ever mentioned in the Analects. So later on in the life of classical Confucianism and the Analects and stories of Confucius in general, there was a great deal of interest in the disciples of Confucius, what they were like, how some of them were clever in some respects, but lacking in other respects, and so on. Lots of character studies of the various disciples. Yen Hui is the one that you can't help but admire. He's Confucius's star student. He grew up very poor. and yet Confucius admired him deeply. And there are a couple passages which could be taken to suggest that Yan Hui was, in some sense, at least a faster study than Confucius himself, like quicker to digest and internalize the insights into the Confucian way. Maybe he was even like kind of more gifted at acquiring virtue than Confucius. I'm thinking of Analects 5:9, really. Some people don't like that interpretation, but it's kind of hard to read it any other way. Anyway, so on top of all that, the fact that Yan Hui was such a gifted student, and yet despite all this adversity he faced in his life, he died tragically young. And there are even a couple passages I'm thinking of in Book 11 where Confucius seems almost to be howling in grief, and there's no apologies for it. He's just really distraught. So anyway, Yan Hui is just a fascinating student. And Analects 2:9 is one where he kind of mentions in passing how it is that he came to be surprised by Yan Hui's moral dispositions, like his capacity to learn the Confucian way. So in 2:9, which we're about to read, actually, let's go back in time. Forget about the fact that Yan Hui died young. We're going back to a moment where Yan Hui was still alive and well, and Confucius is explaining how Yan Hui surprised him in certain respects. I'll read this one. Okay, so this is the Slingerland translation, and the Ted Slingerland translation of Analects 2:9. The master said, I can talk all day long with Yan Hui without him once disagreeing with me. In this way, he seems a bit stupid. And yet, when we retire and I observe his private behavior, I see that it is in fact worthy to serve as an illustration of what I have taught. Hui is not stupid at all. Okay, so just to reiterate, he starts out by saying, I've had these times where I've talked with him all day and he doesn't seem to actually disagree with me. Let me think that he was stupid or foolish or kind of like simpleton, And isn't that interesting, by the way, that Confucius himself expects students to be kind of maybe disagreeing with him, asking challenging questions, that kind of thing. But anyway, he goes on to say, and then when we retire and I observe his private behavior, that's when I find out that actually he understood me very well. And in fact, is illustrating in some ways everything that I've taught. So that phrase that's been translated into English as retire and observe his private behavior, 退而行其思, that Chinese phrase, I can say as someone who works in the later Confucian tradition, is very influential. That appears, particularly that bit about observing his private behavior, appears again and again in later texts in discussions of how it is that you assess someone's character. So this idea that somehow in their private behavior, when their guard is down, right, when they're not sort of on public display posturing for others, right, those are the moments when you can see someone's true character, see how they really feel, their true dispositions. That idea was quite influential.
Yeah, so when the camera is off, behind the scenes, how does someone behave? Because when you know that other people are observing you, you might be more cautious. But how do you really act, spontaneously and naturally, even when, you're not being observed? Yeah, I guess that's the thought here, is that helps to reveal something really important about the person, whether that person is truly virtuous.
Yeah, that's right. There's kind of an implicit insight into what it means to fake moral virtue or fake good behavior, fake good character, which is that a great deal of the faking is done essentially for an audience. It's about deceiving others, not so much about deceiving yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. And there is this question of like, what exactly constitutes private behavior? It's left a little bit open-ended, right? So like, do you have any sense of what Confucius had in mind here? Like in the company of friends, just kind of relaxing, or just kind of, what is private behavior?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I would say that there are multiple theories in the commentaries, the traditional commentaries. The one that seems to be most prevalent, I'd say like that dates back to the earliest period in the commentaries, is that essentially Confucius is referring to the times when, after formal study, Yan Hui has now gone back to kind of just talk casually about what they've learned with the other students. So there's an oft-repeated comment that says something like, well, after they are done with their formal studies, he's just talking. He's kind of hanging out and talking with 2 or 3 other disciples. And that's when he discovers that actually there's a way in which Yan Hui, more than the other students, understands the deeper or more profound, or in some sense, the greater meaning of Confucius's lessons. So on that interpretation, private behavior refers kind of narrowly to just conversations, like informal conversations about what they've learned. But there's another interpretation, which I think you see in a number of commentaries, but since it happens to be in the commentary of Zhu Xi, who is so influential, most people associate it with Zhu Xi, which says that essentially he's talking about everything that Yan Hui does sort of when he's off duty. So sleeping, getting ready for bed, presumably, hanging out and talking with people, even when he's alone, those moments, basically when he's not in any sense in the public eye.
Yeah. Okay. And the other really interesting part of this passage is that Confucius says, "Oh, he realizes Yan Hui is not stupid." Or what's the character here? You. That's the
You,
Chinese.
yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, when we talk about someone being stupid today, we tend to think more about the intellect, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in the Confucian tradition, I think it's really important to recognize that learning and stupidity, all these kinds of what seems to be more cognitive terms have to do with also like moral behavior and proper
Yes.
actions and virtuous acts. That's not how we tend to think of those kinds of terms. So yeah, I've always found that to be quite striking. Like you're not really a learned person, even if you're a super
Yeah.
scientist, but like behave cruelly. I actually really like that part of the Confucian view.
Yeah, it's a nice point. I actually hadn't quite thought about it that way before, Richard. So yeah, this word yu, it's being translated as stupid, and oftentimes that works, but maybe a better, more morally charged way of translating it is to say foolish or something.
Mm.
So the idea is not so much that you're lacking in raw sort of analytical ability or something, but you're
Mhm.
lacking in wisdom and sort of prudence. So if someone is you, then oftentimes they come across as someone who just doesn't have, I mean, it could perhaps in some sense be quite clever, but nevertheless, they lack enough foresight. They don't tend to focus on the right things. They don't tend to worry about the right things. And so they come
Mhm.
across as foolish, meaning they make bad decisions, they pick the wrong means to their ends, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this really important pivotal term, right? Shui, which is like learning or study, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually how it's translated.
Yep.
And it seems like it's a very broad concept, right? So it covers not just like recitation of classics, but also cultivation of one's character and so on. So I always thought that's interesting that they see
Yeah.
it all as kind of deeply interconnected, the kind of cognitive, development together with like development of one's character. It's all kind of like integrated together, or that's how they saw it, it seems.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's important to remind people, especially in talking about classical Confucianism, that when he seems to be modeling or providing some kind of example of study or talking about ideals of study or xue, actually, it might be better to think of that character xue as referring to learning more broadly. If you think of study as simply something kind of bookish, then that's all wrong. The sorts of things that Confucius meant to be doing with his students were things like reading books, but also talking about poetry, interpreting poetry, talking about rituals, talking about why this particular ritual gesture is needed, what is meant to express, what it actually does for the people who practice it and for the audience who witnesses it, and so on. So yeah, there's a lot more sort of emulation of ritual. Back in classical Confucian times, there's a lot of talk, sort of interpretation of music, actually. They're hearing big musical performances and speculating about why the rhythm slows at a certain point and that kind of thing. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so it's much more open-ended and it's much more conversational, not so bookish. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to the idea of like how to understand someone's character. So that seems such an important question generally for anyone interested in virtue or character or moral psychology. And it seems like Confucius here is very observant of how people act normally as you private behavior, but that seems like a very broad category.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, yeah, this next passage that I think that we were going to read also sort of identify certain other ways to figure out or determine whether someone is truly virtuous or what kind of character they possess. Yeah, this next passage comes from Analects 2:10. Yeah, did you want to say something a bit about that, Justin?
Yeah, so I tend to think that a lot of the passages in the Analects, especially the books that were written at an earlier time, they often assume a context that the original audience knows that there's, he's speaking about some one particular person, for example, or some group of people. But this passage doesn't seem to refer to any particular person. It seems like a general description of how it is that you assess character. And that's how later Confucians took it. They took it almost as like kind of a step-by-step manual. First you check this, then you check this, then you check this. Yeah, so I'll let you. This is a very famous passage, by the way. To me, it almost echoes in my mind sometimes. But I'll let you, Richard. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So let me read this next passage from Analects 2:10. So the passage goes as follows. The master said, look at the means that a person employs, observe the basis from which he acts, and discover where it is that he feels at ease. Where can he hide? Where can he hide?
Yeah, that's it. That's the one that echoes. So the phrase, where can he hide in Chinese, that's 人言所在. And essentially that line also appears in the Mencius in a kind of famous passage where Mencius suggests you can discern someone's character by looking into their eyes, really, So it seems it was probably like a stock phrase. And it's a rhetorical question, by the way. So the assumption is he can't hide, that there's some sense in which your true character can't be hidden. And of course, everyone who's following Confucius here understands how difficult it is. But there is a sort of subtle but undeniable optimism about the possibility of discerning people's true character. The assumption is that at some point, if you really know someone well enough, their true character reveals itself. It can't be hidden.
Yeah, so what Confucius says here is, so you look at the means that a person employs. So I guess all the various like instrumental steps by which they try to achieve a certain goal. And okay, which is numerous, right? So everyone wants to support their family or make money for themselves, but how do they go about doing that, for example, right? How do they deal with others in their work, or how do they try to accumulate wealth? There's many different ways you can do that, and some are maybe right or even noble, and some can be quite morally problematic. So
yeah, isn't that interesting? The way most interpreters understand that first bit, look at the means that a person employs, is that they're saying, look at a person's actual behavior. But at least on Slingerland's translation, which I think is the most defensible, that's not strictly what he's saying. They're not just saying, look at their behavior. He's saying, look at the means that they employ. So the assumption is that you already know something about their ends. Like we know human beings, or we know this person that we're assessing. We know what they want. We know what their object is. And what we're doing is looking to see how they achieve those ends. So that makes me think that maybe he's thinking, we're looking to see, for example, if they're cutting corners, So like someone organizes some big social event, and your friend or your student or your child or your parent doesn't want to go to that social event for various reasons, And so given that end that they're going to get out of this social event, what means do they use? So like there's the easy way, right? Where you say, oh, my child is sick, right? Or you have like kind of the stock excuse that everyone will accept, family emergency, very ambiguous, but stock excuse that we always use. But then there's like the, I don't know, sort of just being honest that you're overwhelmed with work at the time, you have too much to do, or that you have to get up early the next morning, so you don't want to stay up late with. Anyway, those sorts of things. So it's a little bit more specific than just looking at someone's behavior. I think it's already assuming a bit of a holistic judgment insofar as it assumes you kind of know what their ends would be, and you're now looking to see whether they cut corners. Sorry, I'm using an English idiom there when I say cut corners. It literally means is that like there's some case where you're supposed to walk in a square, say you're walking around a well-manicured lawn of grass, and people don't want to trample the grass. So you're expected to follow the sidewalk and take a nice 90-degree angle. But it's very tempting to save yourself a little bit of time and cut across the grass, right? That's cutting the corner. And it's meant as a metaphor. It refers abstractly to many things that we do in life where there's an easier way, simpler way that's kind of easier for us. And I think that the passage suggests that you're watching someone to see whether they cut corners in pursuing their ends. Yeah.
Yeah, like we all know that human beings, given what kind of creatures we are, we have shared ends. Like everyone's gonna at a workplace want to raise, right? Or get a higher position. But there's different ways of going about trying to get that desired goal, which everyone shares. Like everyone wants a raise or step into a higher position. So like, how do they do it? Do they just merely try to suck up or lie about the data, or do they just try to do their work the best they can, actually learn, grow in knowledge, and do what's right? So those are really different ways to achieve the same end that we all desire. So it seems like, those things are quite relatable. I mean, it still happens today, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it happens all the time. Like, it's not so much that like people have totally different desires. It's like we all share many of them. We all, to some extent, security, money, and so on. So, yeah,
Yeah,
it's all
that's
about
nice.
how we go about doing that.
Yeah, so I've said that we see a kind of quiet, maybe not so quiet, but anyway, we see a modest optimism or confidence in the ability of people to discern the character of others. And I think you've put your finger on one of the reasons why we have this optimism, which is that we have shared ends. And it's actually not that hard usually to figure out what a person's ends would be, what the objects of their desires would be. Like you say, you're in a workplace. It's not crazy to think that everyone there would love to have a higher salary and many of them would like to be promoted. Not all of them, you know. And it's actually not all that hard to figure out. So then it's just a matter of observing them and a lot of the observing the means that they use. And that too is not very difficult. Like you say, you know, the suck ups, the people who are kind of sycophantic, they're always flattering their superiors. They're transparent. I mean, everyone always knows who those people are at the workplace, right? And that is the easier way of achieving your end than, say, working hard and doing your job well. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I just like the point. Yeah, so the next line says, observe the basis from which he acts. So first you've looked at the means that he's employed. Now you're observing the basis from which he acts. What it says literally is observe that from which it comes, you know, where it comes from.
Hmm.
And because I work on these later Confucians, including Jushi, I can't help but think, I mean, Jushi reads it essentially as look at the proclivity, the inclination, the thought, the sort of the motivation for the behavior. That's how he reads that line.
Hmm.
Everyone seems to agree in the traditional commentaries that the word that's being translated as observe in this case, observe the basis from which he acts, is meant to imply more careful, detailed scrutiny. So it's a harder achievement to be able to observe this sort of thing, figure out what a person's motives are. But presumably those are discernible, they're discoverable. There's a way in which you can figure out what someone's motives are. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the real intention, the true intention behind what they're doing. So, yeah, I mean, we kind of know whenever Thanksgiving comes around, you'll just see on the news that the mayor is going out and giving Thanksgiving dinners to the poor,
Yeah.
right? It happens every single Thanksgiving and you can predict it. And we also kind of know why they're doing it. It's clearly more, usually more for political goals and political ends. Of course, one way to figure out if it's not is, well, have they always been doing that? And do they continue to do it even when it's not Thanksgiving or when the camera's not on
Yes.
them?
Yeah.
And that's one way to determine it, which is, again, going back to, I guess, the observing of, private behaviors when, again, the focus is not on them or it's not publicly notable. How do they behave even in those situations?
Yes.
So I think there is reason for hope here that over time you can uncover the real intention behind what people tend to do.
Yes, exactly. As you say, if you assume that we're not just trying to discern someone's character at a glance or just by a brief acquaintance with them, but in fact, we're talking now about assessing the character of someone that we get to know over time, that we share life with in some ways, then it seems more plausible. And again, if you assume the judgments are sort of in some sense contextual or holistic, that you're not just looking at what they do in specific instances, but how their behavior falls, aligns or doesn't align with other behaviors, that there's a way you can discern their true character that way. And I think there's also a clue in the third step as to how you do this sort of thing. They say, discover where it is that he feels at ease, right? So that seems like something that's much harder to fake, right? So like,
Mm.
what are they really enjoying? Like, so sure, they're reading their Confucian lessons and maybe someone seems to be really enthusiastic about the Confucian way and they ask lots of really astute questions. But like when during their leisure,
Hmm.
are they talking about Confucianism? Are they talking about philosophy? Are they talking about moral psychology? Or are they like gossiping or something, or playing cards or gambling, right? So where do they feel at ease? And then that's the other question. Like, can you fake feeling at ease, right?
Hmm.
Jushi says when he's talking about feeling at ease, he's essentially talking about enjoyment.
Hmm.
What are the activities you enjoy?
Hmm.
The assumption seems to be that maybe you can fake enjoyment for a while, but you can't fake it for too long, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that gets at something really deep, I think, which is, what we take pleasure in and enjoy. It seems so important in terms of understanding, how we can become motivated to even perhaps become virtuous. I mean, that's a point that you find in different wisdom traditions, including obviously in Confucianism, but also in some ancient Greek ethics too, that the trick is to connect, especially people who are young, to actions that are virtuous that they'll also enjoy. So you got to connect pleasure with the right actions, because I think the thought is if you just find something unpleasant to do, then over time you just are going to stop doing it. And so you got to
Yes.
find that kind of bridge. And so help young people, or I guess maybe even hopefully older people, like gain enjoyment out of doing what's right. I guess,
Yeah.
of course, maybe that's not that easy, but that seems like the general strategy for a lot of those who are interested in virtue and cultivation of character.
Yeah, I think that's right, Richard. The way you've put it is to say, essentially, you have to get some joy out of these sort of virtuous activities. That maybe not right away, but the joy, the pleasure in it, or the joy of doing it has to come relatively quickly, or else you just won't be motivated to continue. And so that's a kind of instrumental justification. That's a kind of empirical claim, really, that like people just won't succeed at sustaining virtuous behavior for a long period of time unless, at some point, hopefully pretty soon, they start to enjoy it. That's one reason I think is that figures actually very prominently in the early Confucian theories of moral cultivation. Certainly people like Mencius want it to be a joyful activity. But there's another reason I think that's worth mentioning, which is that it's just part of the very definition of virtue in the truest sense, and the kind of complete sense, that it's wholehearted, which is to say that the virtuous activities are well integrated, harmoniously integrated into your other psychological attitudes and dispositions, so that you're kind of, as a coherent psychological unit, you're all on board. What I have in mind here are passages, and there are many of them in the classical tradition, which suggest that like what distinguishes someone of true virtue, so-called junzi, superior person, gentleman, or shengren, sage, from people who are still at these intermediate stages of their moral development, is often that the fully virtuous person, the moral paragon, doesn't just do good things, but loves doing good things, understands the basis for it. It seems right to them. It comes naturally to them. They do it spontaneously. All of those are ways of sort of indicating that psychologically speaking, virtuous behaviors and the commitment, motivation to do the virtuous stuff is well integrated. That's what I mean by wholeheartedness. So there are these, actually, I think if you just reflect a little bit on your reading, you listeners of the Analects, you'll think of lots of passages that imply a kind of wholeheartedness criterion for virtue. One of them that people seem to know is 620. And once I tell you about it, you'll probably remember it. It's the one where it says, knowing it is not as good as loving it, and loving it is not as good as taking joy in it, right? So, and most people understand the antecedent of it, to be the way. So, knowing the way is one thing. That's great. That's not as good as loving the way, meaning sort of actually having a desire to do it, it's how, sure, I believe, being fond of the way. And that's not as good as taking joy in it. So isn't that interesting? It suggests that there's something more than loving the way, which is to actually derive joy and pleasure from practicing it, maybe from sharing it with others.
Yeah, I mean, someone who is begrudgingly doing something like, giving or helping out a friend or giving a gift is not really a generous person, right? They're just, maybe they even think, oh, I should do it. And so they still maybe do the right thing in that sense. But a truly virtuous person or a truly generous person would do it gladly. And so I think that's a kind of a pivotal point that it flows out of the virtue ethical tradition. Yeah, that's right. So there needs to be a kind of harmony and synchronization between like what you deem to be good together with what you want to do and also what you take pleasure in. Those are all sort of deeply interconnected. And once you're fully developed morally, then those things will sort of come together.
Yes,
now,
that's right.
I did have this question though, like what if someone raises this objection that, well, yeah, but isn't it the case that often like doing what's right can be painful? To do the right action requires you to sacrifice quite a bit. So you won't get promoted because you have to tell the truth. And in fact, maybe you'll even be fired. But the right thing to do is to, or I don't know, like whistleblowing cases, right? It puts you at jeopardy or in danger. I'm sure the Confucians were well aware of actions of that type as well. I mean, even Confucius himself, right? Like sometimes had to do things that was, I think, clearly right, but was not I guess ordinarily people would say, oh, but did not benefit him. So what do you think about those kinds
Yeah.
of cases, and how would Confucians discuss those?
Oh, Richard, you'd love to push these sorts of, you'd love to press these worries about someone's virtue theory, especially whenever I talk about wholeheartedness. Yeah.
I have a lot of Kantian friends,
Yeah,
non-virtue
right.
ethics friends. They always, all day long, they raise these objections to me. So I happily give
Uh-huh.
them to you.
Yeah, those are good friends, the ones that challenge you. Yeah, good philosophical friends. Yeah, so, okay, I mean, here are some things we could say. I mean, obviously, we have to deal with those sorts of worries. Like, it would be weird if there was something that the virtuous person would do, and in a particular case, and Confucius himself wanted to do it, but didn't find it difficult, Like, you've given some good examples. I mean, there are cases where, like, it's just hard. You have to punish someone because you think they need to be taught a lesson or given a good example. But obviously, you shouldn't love punishing someone. So, yeah, how do we handle those cases? I can think of a couple ways of doing it, and I'm not sure which one is the best way to go, or maybe there's some subtle combination of the two. One is that we could sort of stipulate a normal circumstance. So, like, yeah, giving a gift for a friend, that's something that most people, you can reasonably expect that they would enjoy doing.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, if they're really impoverished or living paycheck to paycheck and it's they don't have a lot of money, it's understandable. So, that they would find sort of painful to spend precious money on a gift for someone's wedding or what have you, right? Or birthday. So you could sort of specify a range of normal circumstances and say, under normal circumstances, we'd expect that a virtuous person would enjoy it. But of course, if it's not a normal circumstance, then it's understandable if they find it difficult. That's one way of going about it. Another way of going about it maybe is to specify the kinds of reasons that are legitimate countervailing reasons and the kind that are not. So what I mean by that is, let me give an example. When I say that full virtue is wholehearted in the Confucian tradition, the sorts of examples that come to mind for me in the Analects are Confucius's love of sharing the Confucian way with others. So he says again and again that he just loves studying the Confucian way, and he's so excited about it. And I think implicitly, he loves his students so much that he really doesn't get tired of teaching, right?
Mhm.
And so it's 734, I think, where he says, he kind of declines to call himself a sage. Presumably the students have said, are you a sage? And he's like, oh, no, I would never claim to be a sage. What I can say that I enjoy my teacherly duties without growing tired or weary.
Mhm.
And so, well, what does he mean by that? I think basically we can understand this claim that someone is kind of loves teaching, especially teaching, something like the Confucian way or teaching about morality or ethics. That doesn't mean that they'll like never get tired. Like if their students are trying to wake them up at 3 a.m. or something,
Yeah.
or if like Confucius's son is deathly ill and he's worried about it, presumably
Mhm.
his mind couldn't so easily drug back to the topic of what the sage king Shun did back in the day or what have you.
Yeah.
That seems implausible. So those countervailing reasons are admissible in some sense, right? As
Mhm.
reasons to
Yeah.
be tired and
Mhm.
reluctant to teach. But there are other reasons that we would expect as a part of the kind of profile of the virtue that wouldn't be admissible. Like, I don't know, losing patience with your students when they don't seem to understand, like getting impatient when they don't immediately get it. That
Mhm.
seems like something that someone who really loves the Confucian way and cares about teaching wouldn't have struggled with. They would just kind of naturally integrate this into the flow of their teaching and allow that some people, it takes more time for it to sink in. You just have to give another example. In fact, you're excited to give another example. So you see what I mean? You could just sort
Yeah.
of like specify the sorts of reasons that are legitimate countervailing reasons and the ones that are not, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that's a great distinction. Yeah, I mean, if someone needs to, yeah, I mean, it'd be weird to say someone who needs to act virtuously and lose his job for calling out a company, right? For
Yeah.
doing something like, I don't know, poisoning the local river. I mean, and to say, well, he's going to lose his job and it's going to be very challenging. We could say, like, yeah, it's reasonable for him to be not happy or upset that, he's going to have to find new work or he's going to be out of a job for many months even though he believes what he's doing is right and he would do it again. So that seems like, no, that's not something that would go against his virtue, as opposed to something like he's upset because, I don't know, I guess a virtuous person maybe wouldn't gamble, but if he bet money on some sports team and he lost and that gets to him.
Right.
Yeah. So those
Or
are really
just,
different things.
yeah, or like, oh, there goes if he's thinking, oh, I've spent years cultivating this relationship with this boss and he really likes me. And now I really thought I was up for the next promotion or something, That
Hmm.
doesn't seem like a good reason, just to think of this relationship as in merely instrumental terms as one that you've invested in, like that you spend a lot of time thinking that you'll be able to cash out on this relationship at some point. If that's your countervailing reason, obviously that's not a very good one,
Mm-hmm.
And then, but like, of course, if your countervailing reason, your reason to be reluctant to to blow the whistle on your boss is that like, it's going to be hard for your family. Like you're paying your child's university tuition right now, and it's going to be hard for you to cover that without the job. That is a legitimate reason to be at least reluctant or grudging in blowing the whistle. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right.
I just wanted to say a little bit more about this, though. I think, forgive me for doing this, but I happen to have written on a particular topic that's somewhat related to this theme of assessing character. And it's the topic of essentially Confucian views historically about the various ways of identifying virtuous candidates for government office, right? So the assumption, if you're at all, even in the minimal sense, a decent Confucian political thinker, you assume that government depends upon getting people of good character into office. Those are the people who should be running things. And so that, of course, raises this really important question. How do you identify those people, right? And nowadays, anyone who knows their East Asian history knows that, well, the answer is civil service exams. Thanks to Confucianism, they would administer this test. Students would go out and write oftentimes essays, sometimes poetry, Anyway, the standard thing was to write these kind of interpretive essays on important policy questions, and especially questions on the classics, particularly the Confucian classics. And so for centuries, not just in China, but for example, in Korea, that was how you identified the people who were kind of good candidates who were eligible for high office, was their performance on these civil service exams that focused on Confucian classics. So that's one way, supposedly, of assessing character. But in fact, historically speaking, most Confucians who lived under these regimes of civil service exams, and now we're not talking about Confucius, civil service exams post-date the life of Confucius by many centuries, right? So we're talking about later Confucians, like Zhu Xi, Wang Yangming, anyone in the Song dynasty and thereafter. They lived in a world where basically the only pathway for people who weren't in the royal family to get into government, except for some times where the offices could be bought, for the most part, the only pathway was doing well in the civil service exams. And most of them found it a pretty poor indication, doing well on the exams to be a pretty poor indicator of one's actual virtue. So why did they think that? I think if we look at these two passages, well, first of all, they do often cite these two passages to justify their skepticism about use of exams. And I think you can see implicitly a kind of some psychological presuppositions and some suppositions about the nature of virtue itself, which explain a lot. And that is essentially that virtue, in its fullest sense, is wholehearted. So that's the kind of positive side of this psychological picture. And we've discussed that. The negative side is that when you're not fully virtuous and you're instead faking it, all right? So you're kind of, as a phony, you're pretending to be virtuous, right? You can only fake it for so long. And that's because not having sort of wholehearted virtue, it comes at some psychological, psychic cost, right? There's some energy that's required to expend on your faking it. When you truly love studying the Confucian way and teaching it to others, then it's like, it's actually invigorating in some way, right? The more you do it, the more you love it or something. But when you don't love it, then you're just, you're pretending. And pretending actually is exhausting after a while. And you can see this implicitly in both 2:9, where he says, observe Yan Hui in his private moments, in his private behavior. The idea is that those are the moments when he's not faking it, when his guard is down, right? And in 2:10, when it says, discover where it is that he feels at ease, right? That's referring to these moments where you're actually seeing what they're enjoying, So as for things like civil service exams, anyone can fake it for a while, for some hours or even for some days, and write these high-minded essays, denouncing the kind of corruption and moral decrepitude of people these days and that kind of thing. I don't know about you, Richard, but there have been periods in my life as a professor where I kind of got the sense that my students thought that's what they were supposed to write about in their essays. They're supposed to supposed to sound really high-minded. And,
like college admission essays, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Is exactly full of those.
Yeah. So anyway, so someone can kind of adopt that attitude for a while and maybe even kind of lean into it and write as though they believe it. But
Hmm.
if it's not wholehearted, then at some point you're going to get tired. And because false virtue does reach this point of fatigue and it requires a certain amount of willpower, and that requires a certain amount of energy and willpower, which is a finite resource. And therefore, invariably, your guard will come down.
Hmm.
So the view that I find among later Confucians who lived and breathed and spent their lives kind of accepting these circumstances they found themselves in, where so much of one's career and sort of public life depended on doing well in the civil service exams. Their view was generally that, like, the only way to really get to know someone was to see them when their guard was down. And they tended to read these passages as suggesting that your guard would come down eventually if you were a faker.
Hmm. Hmm.
So true virtue is, as we say in our paper, Jeremy Reed and I wrote this paper on testing for virtue. True virtue is indefatigable. It's something that can't really be exhausted,
Hmm.
with an exception carved out for the sorts of situations that you were just describing, Richard. So not just one exception, many exceptions. But within a certain sort of range of behaviors and considerations, it's something that you find invigorating and enjoy. And for the fakers, that's not the case. And that's why if you kind of see someone over time and get to know them over time, you'll eventually see them when their guard comes down. And that's why we can be optimistic about the possibility of actually knowing someone's character. That's why this phrase, "where can he hide," is a legitimate one. There's some sense in which, at least if you see someone over time, their guard is going to come down and they won't be able to hide.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. So the civil service examination, okay, so do I have this right that they do seem to be thinking that, okay, no, that's not in and of itself a bad test, or it does maybe reveal some little thing about someone's character, but it's just like everyone could fake it during that examination period. Whereas maybe from my point of view, like
Hmm.
it's not clear to me why such a written exam itself even shows anything about the person's character. Was the exam, I guess, more virtue oriented? Because, yeah, I mean, if you think about like SATs, what does that show about anyone's character? But maybe
Yeah.
it's a very different kind of exam. I guess they're commenting on different passages from the classical text, like the Analects, and
Yeah.
maybe asking or asked about how someone should act in various situations to behave properly. So maybe they did think that, yeah, no, it would reveal something about the person. Whereas
Yeah.
maybe I'm thinking someone who's a really bad human being can maybe have good cognitive skills and just write these things with no real kind of ethical commitment or having any real moral decency.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Okay, so I have to say, like, it's not crazy to think that there's at least some reliable correlation between the quality of one's sort of essay answers on a civil service exam on Confucian classics, which are essentially a lot about ethics, politics, morality, right? And their actual character. So here's some reasons for thinking that. First of all, let me just say there are people who've held this view. I mean, obviously, they administered the civil service exams. The institution of the civil service exams came about because there were people who thought this is a better way of assessing character and at least the imperial government getting some sense or grip on how much good character a person has. Han Yu, the Tang Dynasty Confucian, seemed to believe that done rightly, assessing the essays and even in some sense the style of writing of a person could tell us something about their character.
Mm.
And it seems like, I don't know, here's one reason: someone who really is interested in ethics and moral psychology and moral cultivation, that kind of thing, will be more motivated to read the Confucian texts and read them deeply and think about them deeply, right?
Mhm.
And so for those reasons, someone who seems to have thought very deeply about a topic that comes up in the Mencius or even in the book of poetry or something may be more likely to be a good person. But
Mhm.
the problem is that there are so many ways of faking it. I mean, it's quite possible that you could love reading Confucian texts and love reading the moral psychology. I'll just speak for myself here, because you're geeking out about psychology,
Exactly.
and
Right.
you can even kind of fool yourself, maybe if you're just a mere careerist, and really get into it without actually having a deep or sincere and abiding interest in actually making yourself a better person. I think academically, we've all experienced this, especially those of us who work in philosophy or in the humanities or social sciences. Like, they're the scholars who seem to be really motivated. Like, they write a lot about issues that are kind of politically important, issues of social justice that are salient, but they don't seem to be all that personally interested in living their lives in accordance with the standards that they themselves purport to endorse in their academic writing. Another thing that comes up sometimes is, I mean, Jushi likes to point out, like, yes, he probably would concede that someone who passionately cares about moral psychology and moral cultivation and such is going to enjoy and derive a great deal of intrinsic motivation from reading Confucian texts. But there are all these weird, perverse incentives in writing examination essays that sort of get in the way. So one of them is novelty and originality, like over and against the stereotype that some people may have of Confucian education and Confucian examinations and that sort of thing. If you were a examination official in the Song dynasty, which is to say someone who actually writes up the tests and then grades the essays, you get so bored of seeing the same answers again and again. And so that when you see an essay, apparently, that says something original and new, even if in fact it comes at some cost, like someone said something new and original, but not very plausible, right? Or new and original, but actually shocking. Maybe it shocks the conscience or something. You're just the yearning for novelty on the part of examiners made them more likely to sort of respond positively to it. So Jushi famously kind of passed the highest level of the civil service exams at quite a young age. And he credits a certain amount of Chan Buddhist BS, kind of like a BSing skill that he thinks he picked up from his Chan Buddhist teacher for it. He didn't feel like he understood entirely what he was talking about, and yet he was able to say all these things that sounded profound. At one point, he has this great analogy. He says, the problem is that these examination officials, they read these essays again and again, and everyone is trying to write about some particular issue that has been written about many times. And so he says it's kind of like pressing grapes to make wine, You can press them a couple of times and get a lot of juice out of them. But if you're going back to the same old dregs, squeezing just to get another little droplet out, that's essentially where both test takers and test assessors find themselves, is looking for just one little droplet of juice.
Yeah. So you might be rewarded for just like very clever, novel phrasing, but it doesn't really have as much substance. It's not like necessarily something that is insightful. As you were speaking, I was also thinking, wow, maybe this conversation also demonstrates how maybe different those exams were from the exams that you and I are a bit more familiar with in the modern American times. For example, like the SATs. I mean, there's no way in which we think they're testing anything about, moral character or essay writing for the admissions offices. And also, I mean, even the way we think of philosophy when we read like ethics papers or books, we're analyzing them, we're looking at the arguments, we're seeing if the inferences are valid, if it's a sound argument, and we're reading it for different reasons. But the Confucians, I guess, they think, well, no, these examinations test your understanding of these important texts, like the Analects or the Mengzi. And I guess presumably they're thinking when you read those texts, you're not just like trying to find clever connections or, looking at logical consistency. You're reading it and in order to become good, and you are reflecting carefully on the moral messages, and you're trying to draw connections that are morally enriching and has some practical relevance to your character and your life. And I guess, what's striking is how that is not how we think of, moral philosophy today, right? In the way we do it as an academic at a university. At least I don't think that's what most people think they're doing when they're reading even very good works of philosophy. It's a very different mode of inquiry.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a famous passage in Analects where he says that people in ancient times, when they engaged in learning for the right reasons, learned for themselves, for their own sake, whereas people now learn for the sake of others. And what he means by that, by long-standing tradition, is essentially that people in ancient times learned for the sake of their own improvement. They the motivation to learn was essentially to become a better person and figure out how they could apply it to their own lives for the sake of, self-improvement. And whereas nowadays it's mostly for show, he's suggesting, people learn to impress others. And so that was an oft-quoted phrase. In fact, it's quoted so often, I sometimes wonder if there are people using the phrase without even realizing what its source was. But that phrase appears again and again. And so the assumption seems to be that when you're administering civil service exams, and then presumably when you're assessing them, you're supposed to be figuring out whether someone is really kind of engaging in this study of histories or poetry or Confucian classics for their own sake in that sense, in the sense of Analects 1424. That said, and you're right, that's very different. So the GRE, the SAT, a classroom exam is like, it's quite clear that the success criteria in those cases is essentially whether you've acquired the relevant skill, whether you've memorized the relevant content, whatever it is that's being tested for, and which is not usually someone's character. So that is a difference. But I do have to say that generally speaking, when it comes to writing, reading someone's writing, it's very hard not to start judging the whole person that's authoring. You know what I mean?
Even in philosophy, you feel that, like academic works in ethics, let's say, like you're reading an article from the journal Ethics, which is, I think, the top ranked journal for those who are publishing in the area of ethics.
Yeah.
They're very technical. They're very, they come up with these ingenious examples or counter examples and really sophisticated arguments. And it takes a lot of work to read through those papers carefully sometimes. And it's such a high level intellectual endeavor. But you're really channeling the real Confucian spirit, which I actually really would find inspiring and admire.
Yeah.
But when I read those papers, I'm usually just kind of bogged down by the technical details. And it seems like, at least in academic moral philosophy, what's prized is that, as opposed to how much improvement this kind of essay can make on the readers.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, you're probably better at that than I am, at separating the judgment of the character of the author from the work itself. I'm just thinking of these moments where, I mean, it's true that, let me just concede the point. Like professionally, when I'm reading an article, just like you, all I really care about is, is it convincing? And to be honest, can I use this in some way?
Yeah, because you're doing your own research. Usually, it's pretty instrumental. Just, I mean, not necessarily immoral to do that, but that's kind of what we're usually doing.
Yeah. And then I'll even take a step further and say there are ways in which I'm making judgments about the author that are independent of their character. I'm sort of admiring the creativity of this move that they made, or like how well they break down the argument, and they've carved up all the logical space successfully so that all options are under the microscope, and stuff like that I really admire. And without ever sort of once thinking, oh, and are they a good person, or would I be good friends, But there's still ways in which it appears. I can think of some articles where like the author has kind of told a funny anecdote about their relationship with their spouse, that like will be sort of charming or maybe not charming. I'll be like, oh, what kind of parent are you? What kind of husband or spouse are you? Like I can think of someone who writes on philosophy of well-being who would mention his tastes in music now and then, would talk about like the bands he'd listen to, which happened to align with mine, I can't help but then like the author more, So, I mean, this is all meant to sort of explain why it is that even though, in principle at least, the test officials in historical China in the Song Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties were supposed to be assessing these essays by a variety of criteria that include their morality, it wouldn't be surprising if sometimes other judgments of the author were outshining those, such as the originality of the author, or like how kind of creative a philosopher, or how good they are as a close reader of text, that kind of thing. Especially, once again, if they're just reading the same essays on the same topics again and again and again, and kind of seeing the same sorts of answers,
I mean, so one important Korean philosopher that comes to my mind in this conversation is Lee Tae-ge. So like he's very famous. He's on the one of the basically like the dollar bill in Korea.
Yeah.
So, in Korea, instead of having like George Washington, we'll have Lee Tae-ge would be one of the scholars on there, because he's considered one of the great scholars of Korean history, and also well known as a very virtuous person. And one revealing fact about him is that he kept turning down all these high-ranking, powerful positions. And so the king would have to drag him, force him to take it up. And all he wanted to do was just study the classics on his own. So there we go. I guess that reveals that he probably was a pretty good person. But he complained bitterly about a lot of people being so focused on the civil service examination in Korea, because he just thought like everyone's just trying to get this, high-ranking position and role. And he thought the true Confucian wouldn't bother themselves with taking such an examination, because they don't care about that kind of power. They care about becoming a virtuous human being. And so Yeah, a lot of the later Confucians. I'm sure we find that in China too, or probably
Yes.
Japan or wherever.
Yeah, actually, when I was working on this paper, I read a lot of the texts, which are essentially notes on conversations between teachers and students. There were a
Mm-hmm.
lot of those. The Chung brothers, Zhu Xi, Wang Yanming. That's a kind of one of the standard genres in which a philosopher passes down their teachings is by having their students record notes and then later generations read sort of succinct summary versions of those conversations. And it's amazing. It's not surprising, really, that those who lived in these times when civil service exams were so important for one's kind of long-term career and overall kind of prosperity and success in life, that they spent a lot of time talking about how to prepare for the civil service exams, and that among the Neo-Confucians, now I'm thinking about the Chinese Neo-Confucians, that they spent a lot of time, not just the teacher, but the students, kind of with a very fine-grained comb, picking apart people's motives to pass the exams. So they, just like Twege, Zhu Xi and his students, and so many others in the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties, were pretty convinced that like a lot of their peers were basically motivated by careerist ambitions and the desire for fame and success to learn these Confucian materials. And they also worried that their own motivations would slip into those more career-minded or self-interested, more superficial sorts of drives. And so, yeah, there was a lot of hand-wringing, I would say, about how it is that you kind of continue to have the right incentives and desires and motivations to study these Confucian materials. And by the way, this kind of links up with something we talked about earlier. I said earlier there was this, like, maybe what we need to do in order to answer those Kantian skeptical friends that you have is kind of develop a profile of reasons that are countervailing reasons that are admissible or not admissible for being reluctant to do the virtuous thing. You see the teachers and students in the stuff that I read doing that with respect to the civil service exams. So like sometimes the students will go to Zhu Xi and say, gosh, there's like this student who's really ambitious, really driven. And Zhu Xi will say, yes, that's true, but that's because he was born into poverty and he's worried that his parents won't be provided for in his old age. So he really needs this job. He needs a government position. That's understood as an admissible reason to care about doing well in the exams as such,
How about making your parents proud? Would that be admissible?
Oh, wow.
Just that itself? Because that seems such a common desire that I would imagine a lot of them would have. Or is that too externally connected?
Wow, that's a tough one. And all I can say is, here's a stab at it. I feel like I'm not going to really be able to articulate this distinction very well. But I want to say yes and no. So if the goal in making your parents proud is in some sense purely other-oriented, that is, it's really just because you want your parents to be proud of their child, right? And somehow the fact that that child is you is only incidental to your considerations,
Okay.
then that's perhaps admissible. But if it's more about like, oh, I want my parents to be proud of me, which in some sense will reinforce my own sense of pride and so on.
Yeah, you want to make your parents happy in the first case. Like that's what you really care about.
Yes. Okay. Right. Yeah. Well, I think we've, in some sense, both wandered far from the main topic and yet in some sense have stayed right on topic. So we've talked about civil service exams and the motivation to study them and Twege and the Neo-Confucians and such. But this all comes up because on my reading of the later Confucian tradition, these two passages that we discussed today are touchstones for so much discourse later about how it is that you really do assess someone's character. And so they're good passages to know. And I still find, if you read deeply in the Neo-Confucian literature, you'll see that they take Analects 2:10, which is the more general one, not the one about Yan Hui, but the one that just says, look at the means they employ, look at the basis from which they act, discover where they feel at ease. And they break that down into sort of steps, like first you observe their behavior, then you try to figure out what their motives are, and then finally you kind of see them when they're relaxed and at ease and figure out what they're actually enjoying. And if you do that, and if you understand these as sort of really careful, detailed observations that are in some sense holistic, that show how their behaviors and their attitudes fit into a whole life, then in those cases, you're more likely than not, we'll put it that way, to succeed at assessing their character and figuring out whether they're a decent person or not. And that's important for all kinds of reasons. We've been talking about the importance of appointing good people to office, putting them in charge of others. People's livelihoods are dependent on those who hold high office, high political office. That's an important reason. But it's also important just for purposes of like figuring out who make a good friend, who's like reasonably trustworthy and reliable, that kind of thing. So on the Confucian view, it's unavoidable, and it's just part of the regular fabric of life that you have to make these assessments of character, and thus they're quite interested in how you do it.
Oh, definitely. This is very relevant to, I think, everyone's lives. Yeah, I think we've all had experiences of, again, we talked earlier about misjudgment of character and connecting, because, our lives are finite and limited, and you want to be around people that you can trust and that you can grow from and learn from. Yeah, I'm kind of blown away by how just these two passages really, there's so many important insights here and deep issues that are addressed, in terms of human motivation and character.
Yeah. Actually, talking with you about this, Richard, just now, I'm realizing another theme that people would probably like is to talk about Confucianism on friendship. Because one thing that Confucianism has in common with some other ancient traditions is they uphold and recommend what are sometimes called virtue friendships, where it's a common interest in virtue and a shared commitment to improving one's own and the other's character. That is the basis
I must say I was always a little bit like torn about that issue. But I think as I get older, I appreciate that virtue or character-based friendship more and more as sort of the ideal type. And I think there's a lot more there to be said about that. Yeah.
I'm torn too. In some ways, I think it's just unrealistic. On the other hand, it's one of the more satisfying sorts of relationships you can have in life. Okay, well, but yes, that is certainly another topic. So
definitely. Yeah.
So we'll save that for another time, and we'll say that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.